Kia ora and welcome to the Itinerary. Today we will be discussing food tourism, which we define as the practice of travelling to and enjoying activities that provide experiences of consumption and appreciation of food and beverage. This could be as simple as heading to Bluff for, the annual Oyster and Food Festival, or visiting your local winery in the Wairarapa. Or you may be a dedicated foodie who travels the world to experience cuisine and ingredients of different nations. Now, when you think about food destinations around the world, you'll surely be thinking of places like Italy, Japan, Spain and Thailand, to name but a few. But what about New Zealand? How do we rank as a food destination? Here with me today are two ladies critical in the growing food tourism movement here in New Zealand. Sarah Meikle, the CEO of Wellington Culinary Events Trust and Festival Director of Wellington on a Plate, and Annie Dundas, Program Director of Tourism at ATED, soon to be Auckland Unlimited. Kia ora to you both. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio today.
Kia ora.
Lovely to be here.
Sarah, you're working on a food strategy with Tourism New Zealand and are basically the backbone to Wellington's food scene. And Annie, you've been integral in the food industry. The strategies being developed for Auckland. Tell me, why is it that we need food strategies, and how will they align with tourism?
Well, I think we've all got to eat, right? And I think it's become a really important piece of the tourism puzzle, the visitor puzzle, as people come to New Zealand or anywhere. They want good food, and increasingly they really seek out those food choices.
Food tourism is the foundation of any and all tourism. Every single visitor has to eat. So I suppose what Annie and I are working on is making sure that some of those eating experiences are very memorable, and that New Zealand and the destinations around New Zealand are showing what they have, what is best, what's in season, what's grown locally, and that visitors and also locals alike can enjoy those and understand what those things are.
Is food tourism a worthwhile market to explore?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, the improvement in what is being delivered and offered by many of our suppliers in hospo and so on has just gotten better and better and better. And so it's a really integral part of what we try and do. And as we said before, everyone has to eat, but actually what we're trying to encourage is that people really seek out those really good experiences. And there's some amazing, unique opportunities in food tourism now.
People probably don't realise or acknowledge just how broad the food sector is. So the food sector is everyone from the grower, the farmer, the winemaker, right through to the cooking class or the restaurant or the farmer's market, or even just having fish and chips on the beach when you go to Nelson. And so I think, when we say, is it a worthwhile market to explore? Well, people are already exploring it. I think one of the things that we really need to help people understand or really work on it is its accessibility, so people can actually, access experiences and, as Annie said, know what's best in places.
Are there any destinations or experiences around the world that you believe New Zealand could learn from in particular?
Oh, I think there's many. I mean, food's such a universal kind of concept, and I suppose in New Zealand we're lucky because we have this very multicultural society. I think Auckland's got 186 ethnicities in it, so we're learning all the time in terms of ingredients and so on. I suppose countries overseas that do it well, there's the usual, the French, the Frances, the Italians, etc. But I think we have our own uniqueness to add into the mix as well, which I think is the exciting part for the New Zealand food story journey.
I agree, and I think we do learn from lots of established food cultures. Obviously, we've got traditional cultures. I think one thing where we beat ourselves up a bit about here in New Zealand is that we don't have a food culture. We actually haven't really been focused on this for very long. Think of it, Italy, thousands of years of history, and New Zealand's still got a bit of catching up to do. But, I look at destinations, obviously those established ones, but I also look at, perhaps more pop culture destinations and some of the amazing experiences you can have in places like New York, where you actually experience the neighbourhoods of New York. And, New Zealand, with all of its multiculturalism, can offer some of those types of experiences.
What is it though, ladies, that makes a destination a food destination?
Well, I guess it's obviously the variety of what is on offer, but it's also the people. I mean, the passionate individuals, as Sarah mentioned before, around from the grower all the way through to the chef who's delivering it on the plate, the front of house staff, that is all part of the food story. And I think Wellington can be credited with being a city that really got stuck into that in the early days, and now Auckland kind of has an opportunity to do that as well. So it's really from grower all the way through.
Yeah, and it says also a food destination is somewhere that kind of, I suppose, has got its act together and kind of knows what it needs to be famous for. But in reality, a food destination is somewhere that is a reflection of Kiwi life. So if it's a Southland cheese roll, or you mentioned the Bluff Oyster Festival or the Whitianga Scallop Festival, those are all reflections of Kiwi life and things that we enjoy, and they're, the things that define them as a food destination.
What are New Zealand's key selling points for international visitors?
So I guess from our side, what we've obviously our Indigenous food's really, really important, and we're starting to see Indigenous ingredients and things start to come through in far more restaurant menus, and so it's becoming a little more normal. So it's really nice to see that we've got Riwi Spraggan here, who has the hangi master, and he's now serving up his hangi to Ben Bailey at Ahi, to Peter Gordon at Homeland, to St Alice. So we're starting to see very traditional foods sort of interweaving into some of these more these larger scale restaurants, and I think that's really important for us to share the story of our Indigenous food culture as well.
And internationally, I mean, obviously our Maori food culture, our Maori culture in general is our most unique factor. So it is definitely a focus. But I think broadly speaking for New Zealand, our reputation of fresh, good food is still very much core to our story. But also here in New Zealand, for visitors who come to New Zealand, it's about accessibility of that food and actually being able to go to the source. So whether that source is a farmer's market or visiting the farm or the fisherman or whatever, I think that accessibility is really a really important part of our story, because for a lot of people, actually finding out where their food is from or meeting the person who made it is actually almost impossible.
We talk about people. How can our audience become a part of this New Zealand food story that we're trying to change and trying to share? I
mean, I guess we're trying to encourage people to get out and, as Sarah said, meet the growers, meet the people, find out where your food comes from. So there's a responsibility factor in learning about, the sustainability of food. So is that particular vegetable or meat or whatever it might be has a sustainable background? Can it be traced? I think those are important things that people need to be a bit more aware of. What are we putting down our throats, and making sure that that is sustaining a grower or a community, and I think that's really, really important.
And as an extension of that, most people are sort of part of it already, whether they like it or not. They're part of our food story. But I think it's also about being proud of what we have here in New Zealand and what we produce. Sometimes people can get a bit cringy, but actually, we have some of the world's most incredible products and incredible food, and we should be very, very proud of that.
How do you imagine New Zealand's food story may progress over, let's say, the next 20 years?
Well, I'd love every visitor that comes here, when we are allowed to have international visitors, I want them coming here and seeking out those really incredible, unique experiences, whether that's visiting a Michael van der Elsen cook school or taking in some of our food and wine festivals around the country, or touching and meeting chefs and kind of growers, and actually really coming and knowing about those things before they come. So I think visitors come and they kind of go, oh, your food's amazing, but actually we want them to come for the food first. So I think that would be great.
I want people to have ready access to information, be able to plan an itinerary and make sure that food is part of that. And I also want New Zealanders to be able to kind of be part of that story. So, we talk about obviously people like Riwi Spraggan being now providing hangi into restaurants. I want Indigenous ingredients to be available to people in the supermarket. I want people to be able to buy local, and native herbs, and actually be able to use them in their food and know how to use them, so that it actually is very much part of New Zealand's food culture.
Annie, Sarah, we appreciate your time, we appreciate your work, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the near future. Next on the panel, we will talk to a couple of experts about one of New Zealand's best products, wine. But before we move on, let's hear from one of New Zealand's favourite chefs, Ben Bailey, as he discusses food tourism in Aotearoa.
My name's Ben Bailey. I'm a chef. I write the menus in a few restaurants, including Ahi, where we are right now. Food tourism is interesting. Just about every country in the world's nailed it except for us. I really see New Zealand as a mini New York. We have a similar amount of cultures living here, similar amount of languages spoken. We just don't have the population, but we are a melting pot similar to New York, and we're on the cusp of greatness, I think, when it comes to food tourism. We've never sort of had a clear message, say, from the government that, or from anyone really, that people should come here and eat. What is the spend of an average tourist from overseas in New Zealand on hospitality? Would it be 1/4 of their spend? Would it be 1/3 of their spend if you consider their accommodation? It's a huge proportion. And I think Kiwis haven't taken it seriously. We've relied on our great scenery, but there's a lot of great restaurants around too, and people are looking, and you look at our bookings and we have a lot of international numbers when the borders were open. So it's interesting to see how things will play out. We've got to do it as a whole, as a whole country. Auckland and Queenstown are the two funnels that most people come through now when they visit. But outside of that, I think we're getting to the point now where our small towns in New Zealand have great cafes, have great, they take it seriously. It's not just a packet of frozen squid caught off a trawler off the coast of Southeast Asia that's been frozen and brought here and then deep fried straight from frozen. People want to know where their squid came from, how it was caught, what's so good about it. Why are you in the middle of, say, use my hometown, Te Awamutu, why have you got squid on there? Like, what's the beef growing around? What's the pork? What's on your menu? Why have you chosen it? I think New Zealanders are becoming more aware of what they're eating. They want to support local, eat local. They want to know what's in their food. And as us as New Zealanders become more foodie and want to eat better, live longer, be healthier, our tourists will benefit from that too. I think our selling point in New Zealand when it comes to food tourism is that we're super different. We're multicultural and we have amazing Māori roots. The old people of New Zealand who have been here for 2,000 years. We have an amazing climate, defined 4 seasons, and with very fertile land produces amazing ingredients, and we have beautiful oceans that are at the moment largely in good shape. I think the proposition is for me to come to a country that's got similarities to theirs but is completely different. Our food story is young, very young, and so now we look at the unique ingredients of New Zealand when I'm thinking about New Zealand food story, how they're harvested, packaged, prepared, sent to me, that protects the quality of that ingredient. And then I want to know about the people who harvested that ingredient. I want to know what they had for breakfast. I want to know what their life philosophy is. I want to know everything about them because that determines their philosophy around harvesting that ingredient, how sustainable that ingredient is. Will that ingredient be around for my grandkids to harvest too? So in the next 20 years, I see a lot of young chefs coming through, a lot of young chefs coming home from overseas and sharing their experiences, wondering what New Zealand food is, really putting our food on the map when it comes to creating dishes that represent New Zealand on the world stage.
Without a doubt, one of the more popular subtypes of food tourism is wine tourism. New Zealand is recognised as the premier producer of Sauvignon Blanc, representing about 78% of producing vineyards. But we are also seeing a steady increase in other grape varieties, most notably Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And despite New Zealand producing less than 1% of the world's wine, Tourism New Zealand statistics show that around 25% of international tourists seek out a wine experience while here. With me now to talk more about wine and tourism is Michael Henley, Director of Aotearoa New Zealand Fine Wine Estates and a member of the Hawke's Bay Tourism Board. Plus Rob Eliott, Managing Director at Lemongrass Productions, the agency behind great wine events such as Winetopia and Auckland Wine Week. Kia ora to you both. Thank you so much for joining me.
Kia ora.
I'd love to start by getting your opinions on what makes New Zealand wine just so special.
From my perspective, New Zealand wine is just so unique, and it's got a freshness and an appeal and an instant drinkability to it that just keeps people coming back for more.
I think New Zealand wine's quite unique in just the sheer diversity that's been created over the last, say, 50 years. New Zealand wine scene, although it's been going for a little while, it's really exploded. We're up to 700 wineries around the country right now, and that's a huge achievement for a small country. And it's just happened so fast. And I think the reason that it's happened so fast and so well is just the collaboration within the wine industry. And we get this all the time when we're bringing in international speakers for our events. we always hear how wonderful it is they get to come to New Zealand and work in with all the different winemakers and people in the wine industry here, because it is such a great collaborative feeling. And everyone's sharing information. So you take something like Pinot Noir, which, like you mentioned, is quite a recent, rock star within the New Zealand wine scene. It's because you've got some of these great Pinot Noir makers who are actually all working together and happy to share sort of the knowledge that they've gained, and that's sort of, I think, set New Zealand wine on a trajectory which is much stronger than what the size of the country would otherwise suggest.
Now, I remember a couple of years back, Kumeu River won a few blind taste tests against some of those reputable and affluent French brands, but it wasn't headline news. I'm curious to know if our wines are getting the international recognition they deserve.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, absolutely we are. But we can always get more. I mean, the Kumeu River example was a great one, and within the wine world, it was hugely well known about the fact that here was this little Chardonnay producer out of West Auckland who had gone and beaten the Burgundians with their Chardonnays at their own game, and it was within within our world, that was something we knew a lot about. We were pretty proud of, but I think, and New Zealand wine generally on a world stage has an amazing reputation, and it gets a lot of press, and people do know it. But look, as a producer, we're always looking for more, and we'd always like more. And I think, to Rob's point, that diversity means that if we're starting to get more stories about different things, that all adds to the bow as well. So look, we're always going to take more, but we are getting some good kudos out there in the world markets. Yes.
Now, for this episode, we've been talking to others about New Zealand's food story, what it currently is and how it is that we'll be growing it in the future. How is it that we make New Zealand a food destination, just like Italy and Thailand, for example? Do you think that our wines are a part of this story, gentlemen?
Yeah, absolutely. The food and wine story of New Zealand really goes hand in hand. So much so that I think, the quality of our wine has really changed people's perception overseas of what New Zealand is. I remember working in London 15 years ago, and English people there saying how sophisticated New Zealand must be because our wine is so good. And I think that has really rubbed off also on our food story. We have some incredible food here, and before I was doing wine events, we were running food, high-end food festivals, and really, it is that quality statement of our wine is rubbing off on our food reputation as well, which up until that point had been more about sort of a primary producing nation. Now people were starting to come here and go, "Oh God, the food and wine in New Zealand is really quite special, isn't it?" And yeah. So I think they go hand in hand.
And look, I'm in Hawke's Bay here, and we've always thought of ourselves as the fruit basket or the veggie basket of New Zealand. And from a tourism aspect, we focus very, very strongly on food and wine. When you used to fly into Napier, you'd get to the airport, and as you get off those little ATR planes and you'd walk onto the runway, you'd see a big banner that said, "Welcome to Hawke's Bay Wine Country." But the food and wine story of Hawke's Bay is a massive part of our offering, of our tourism offering. So New Zealand does food exceptionally well, and we do wine exceptionally well. So they go hand in hand, I think, absolutely.
When either of you do travel aboard, do you make it a point to enjoy your wine experience?
Absolutely. Whether we're traveling to a city or a wine producing region, it's one of the reasons we would go traveling in the first place. I think there's few better ways to really understand a place than arriving and looking at what food products are being created there and who's making them, and what wines will go with them. Now, of course, not every place is a wine producing nation. So if you're dropping into Singapore or Hong Kong, you're more likely to seek out the restaurant or the wine bar. But it's an essential part of travel. I mean, you're simply not cooking when you're traveling, not often anyway. And so that food and drink experience for every single visitor is such a big part of their travel experience overall. And so more often than not, and all the research we're seeing is that is what people are seeking out before they travel, and that'll help them choose the destination that they're going to. And so I think for us, certainly, wonderful memories of traveling through Margaret River or through through lots of parts of Europe, where there's just some incredible experiences that you will take back as that snapshot in your mind of that entire country experience. And it might have just been that one day out in the vineyard and that beautiful lunch you had with that kind of amazing vista. Because I think that's the other thing about wineries and what they offer is they're not in bad locations.
How important is wine to the tourism industry in that beautiful Hawke's Bay?
Oh, it's massive. As Rob, just to go back to the travel part of things as well, it's about immersing yourself in the culture of a region or of a place, of a country. When you go to Europe and you sit down in a little bistro in France and you're just immersing yourself in that culture. And the same here in Hawke's Bay. The food and wine story is a very big part of what we do. And coming to a winery and finding the winery restaurant and sitting down on the patio of the winery restaurant and drinking some great wine and enjoying the local food. A lot of the great restaurants of Hawke's Bay, and they're all sourcing local food. It is about immersing yourself into the region and finding out the hidden little meat suppliers or the hidden little chili suppliers or all those type of things. And that's a big part of visiting Hawke's Bay, absolutely. And we've got a whole festival here in Hawke's Bay, which we're currently in the middle of, called the Food and Wine Classic. Fork, excuse the pun, but it's called Fork, FAWC. And that is all about, it's a 10-day program, and it's all about celebrating the great offerings that we have here in Hawke's Bay.
And Michael, you mentioned that wine and tourism go hand in hand in Hawke's Bay, and we know that the cruise industry is huge there also. So can you give us some insight into the relationship between the cruise industry and your wine industry there in the Hawke's Bay?
Well, the cruise industry, we got something like 75 boats coming into Napier last year, and obviously that has been changed with recent times. But this is a willing captive audience of thousands of people who come into the region, and sometimes they may only be here for a day or a few hours, but it doesn't actually matter because they come into the beautiful city of Napier, and they probably are going to one of the great restaurants there, and there's a couple of wine experiences basically in the middle of town almost, where you can have that wine exposure as well as eating in some of the great restaurants of Napier. So the wineries are a little bit different because it depends on the timing of the cruises. Sometimes the cruise ships, if they only have a few hours, it's a bit more difficult for them to get out and around the vineyard areas, which are outside of the cities. But when people have got time, we know that from the busloads of people coming off the port, that wine is something that they are interested in doing. They're interested in going out, seeing a beautiful vineyard, and as Rob alluded to, vineyards are often in beautiful places. But getting out into the sort of rural parts of Hawke's Bay, spending a little bit of time at a winery cellar door and tasting their way through some of the local product, and it's fantastic. So when the cruise ships start to come back a little bit more, it'll be an exciting part of the industry.
And I mentioned before that 25% of international visitors to New Zealand seek out a wine experience. Now, Rob, do you think that they're looking at our wine events? And I'm curious to know the ratio between international visitors versus our domestic tourists of these events.
There are many different wine events. Okay, so there's the regional wine festivals. There are sort of one-day big kind of party events. There are what we do with Winetopia, which we've set up to be a celebration of the whole New Zealand wine scene. Most of these in New Zealand are currently focused at promoting to a national audience. In saying that, the sort of data that we get back from our events are, although most of the people might be residents and living in New Zealand, there's a huge amount of, people from a foreign nationality living here who come to explore the wine scene. So you might have people from Europe or the States or what have you who are here for a few years, and they are definitely a big customer for us. So I think there's that side of it. I think in terms of drawing international visitation for the events, unless it's an event that is targeting and promoting to those people back in their home countries, then it's unlikely at this stage there's going to be a significant number of them coming. In saying that, I think there's a big opportunity going forward for that, and that's certainly something that we're looking at. But I think another point to that is that the events, whether they be big food events or big wine events, have an incredible power to grow a region or a city's reputation, and that reputation can only benefit the food and drink producers of that region and the tourism companies involved as well. And that, I think, is something, if you've been running a big food or wine event for 10 years within a region, then that is often what international tourists will learn about the region first, before they understand the complete food and drink offering that the area has. So I think it's a little bit about getting international arrivals here for the actual event, and it's a little bit about growing the reputation through the running of that event.
Do you think a wine event in New Zealand could ever reach that huge level of popularity that, say, Oktoberfest received for its celebration of beer?
I mean, Oktoberfest has obviously got a very long heritage, so that certainly didn't happen in a decade. It took a bit longer than that. So I think, look, I think we can. I think there are obviously some trade-focused events run by New Zealand wine growers at the moment. The PINA conference is a great example of that. Who deliberately target international media and writers and so forth. And I think really to create an event that targets world media as well as international visitors, definitely. We know that there are some very well-established wineries here in New Zealand already who run their own specific events and have people flying in for them because this is the one time of year where they really get to engage with that winery that they fell in love with on their trip here. So I think there's definitely opportunities to grow that significantly.
In terms of wine and tourism, experiences, products, partnerships, is there anything anyone is doing around the world that you'd love to see adopted here in New Zealand? Or just generally, is there anything that you think we can do to improve upon for our future growth of this part?
I was over in the States in February, and one thing that America does do very well is that they lead the way in the cellar door experience, I guess, and making sure that the offerings that they have as part of the winery experience is really comprehensive, from winemaker tastings in the cellar door type thing, or sommelier tastings. There's just a whole lot of different things that you can do when you visit wineries in places like California. And then I love the idea, and we're doing a little bit here in Hawke's Bay, and there are other places that do it as well. I love the idea of when you go to Healdsburg, or you go to Santa Rosa, or you go to St. Helena, and you see these squares, and the squares are just covered in cellar doors. So people aren't actually necessarily going out to the wineries, they're going to cellar doors in the villages and things like that, where they can taste through the wines, and then they're offered if they want a more special experience, they can go out to the wineries and have a more exclusive, more expensive often, but offering. And I think that from a wine and tourism aspect, New Zealand probably needs to, the New Zealand wineries, we need to start to offer a little bit more to our tourists. Rather than just having the experience where you walk up to the cellar door and unannounced, and you just stand there and you taste 6 or 7 wines, and then you walk off and you go to the next one. I think that what we're starting to see is people are offering a little bit more exclusive opportunities, and I think I hope that that's going to continue to change. And I love that. I love the sense in America where the consumers are really, really welcome. And highly sought after, and they really, really look after them at that first touch point.
Yeah, I agree, Michael, totally. It's really exciting to see the cellar door experience develop here in New Zealand, and there are definitely some shining lights in the New Zealand wine scene doing that. And I think that, for many people, a bit of a bucket list experience is to go and do the champagne tour and tasting at one of the big champagne houses in France, and creating that sort of bucket list experience, wine experience here in New Zealand is it could be incredibly powerful for the overall promotional story of that region. So I think that's really essential. I think the second side of that is it's really exciting now what's going on in the New Zealand food scene, and the chefs that are really striving forward with, I guess, the New Zealand food identity, which is now becoming very, very unique. And really that marriage of the New Zealand wine with the new New Zealand food scene coming together, that's the harmony that we really need to see. And that's the thing that people will remember for many years after the trip here. So I think it's really embracing that and giving it the oxygen it needs to really come together. It'd be a shame if people leave New Zealand having this amazing food experience at this great restaurant, and all they can remember is that wonderful French champagne they had at the same time. So we sort of need to just make sure that we get that right.
And that's all we have time for today. Don't forget to join us next week. I look forward to chatting with you all again, same time, same place. Haere rā.